There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who have already decided what you are. They've given you a label: quiet, struggling, ordinary, and they wear that certainty about you like a comfortable coat. They don't look too hard, they don't ask too many questions, and most of the time, you stop asking them yourself. You start to believe the version of yourself that the world has agreed upon. That is where this story begins. Not with a grand betrayal or a moment of obvious cruelty, but with a woman who had been so thoroughly defined by her circumstances that she had nearly forgotten she was more than them. Her name was Clara Whitfield. She was 31 years old. She waitressed at a diner called the Hollow Spoon in a small town in rural Virginia. And every morning she woke before the sun, tied on her apron, and went to work with the quiet, precise dignity of someone who had decided that enduring was its own form of bravery. She didn't know, on the morning this story truly starts, that the man who had just sat down at table 4, the one with the worn jacket and the careful eyes, had been watching over her life for 3 years. She didn't know that he was the reason she still had a roof over her head. She didn't know that he had loved her through every single one of those silent, invisible years.
The Hollow Spoon opened at 6 in the morning, and Clara was always there by 5:30. This was not a requirement Patty had set, not a rule on any schedule or in any employee handbook. Patty ran the diner with an informal warmth that made formal documentation feel almost offensive. It was simply what Clara had done since the first week, because she was a woman who understood that arriving early to a place was a way of claiming it, a way of saying, "This belongs to me in some small sense. This hour before anyone else arrives belongs to me, and I will use it not just to prepare, but be present in a way the rest of the day won't always allow." She had a system. Systems were her architecture, the structure that kept the days from dissolving into one another without shape or meaning, and this one was non-negotiable. Coffee first, always, because the coffee had to be ready before anything else, and because the first smell of it in the morning was the closest thing she had to a daily ritual that asked nothing of her in return. Then the pie case, which needed restocking from the walk-in and arranging with the kind of care that Patty, for all her warmth, occasionally skipped when she was running behind. Then the condiment station. Then the specials board, which Clara always checked even though she knew Patty wrote the same thing in the same looping cursive every week, because checking was part of the system and the system was the point. And then, always last, always protected, 2 minutes at the window that faced the valley. The valley in the early morning was not beautiful in the way that postcards suggested beauty. It was not grand. It had none of the self-conscious drama of mountains or coastlines. It was simply a stretch of Virginia farmland and woodline, in particular quiet pre-dawn, and what it offered was not spectacle, but a kind of companionable stillness, the sense that the world had not yet decided to demand anything of you, and you could stand in that pause and be genuinely, temporarily unobligated. Clara stood at that window and drank the first cup of coffee that she poured only for herself, and she watched the fog move across the low fields, and she let herself be still in a way she was not still for the rest of the day. Nobody knew she did this. Nobody needed to. Some rituals are private not because they're shameful, but because their power is proportional to their privacy. And Clara understood this in a way she understood most things about her own interior life. Quietly, completely, without the need to explain it to anyone. The diner itself was nothing she would have designed if designing had been an option, and she had made her peace with that years ago. The vinyl on the corner booth had been cracked when she arrived, and was cracked still, patched with a strip of electrical tape that Patty had applied with the confidence of a woman who considers permanence and acceptability to be interchangeable concepts. The ceiling fan above the center tables turned with a wobble that made new customers glance up with a look of mild structural concern, and then glance away when nothing happened, and then forget about it entirely, which Clara had always thought was a reasonable metaphor for how most people handle most uncertainties. The specials board, with its weekly identical offerings in Patty's cursive, hung beside the kitchen window with the cheerful permanence of a landmark. The light in the late afternoon came through the west-facing windows in a way that was genuinely beautiful, a warm, slanted gold that made even the cracked vinyl look deliberate, like something a painting. And Clara had noticed this about the diner the very first time she walked in, 5 years ago, and had thought, "There is beauty here if you know which hour to stand in." She had thought that, and she had decided it was enough, and she had been mostly right. She had come to Hollow Spoon 5 years ago with a toddler on her hip and a look in her eyes that she would later describe, to the very few people she described anything to, as the look of someone who had been running so hard for so long that they'd lost track of what they were running from and were now simply running as a matter of survival habit. Jamie had been 14 months old. She had arrived in Calder, Virginia, with 2 suitcases, a car that needed its left rear tire replaced, and a determination so finely compressed it had the quality of something structural. Not hope exactly, because hope felt too open, too exposed, but the thing underneath hope that doesn't require good outcomes in order to function. Patty had looked at her for 3 seconds, taken in the toddler and the suitcases and the quality of the look in her eyes, and said, "You start tomorrow, 6 sharp. Don't be late." And Clara had nodded, and had not been late once in 5 years, not once, because if Patty's offer had been a lifeline, then Clara's reliability was the way she held it, both hands, no letting go. She was refilling the sugar caddies at 6:12. She always did the sugar caddies during the quiet gap after opening, and before the 7 o'clock rush, because the 7 o'clock rush left no time for anything, and the sugar caddies needed more care than they looked like they needed. When the bell above the door rang, she looked up with the reflexive attentiveness of someone trained by years of customer service to register arrivals without making them feel scrutinized, and she saw him come in. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, though something about the way he held himself, the deliberateness of it, the absence of any performance, made the age hard to pin precisely. He wasn't a large man, not imposing in any physical sense, but he moved through the space with the settled quality of someone who had stopped needing to announce himself, and there was, in the particular way he chose his seat, something that Clara registered without being able to immediately name. He passed the counter stools. He passed the large center table. He went to the window booth, the one that most customers avoided because the morning light came straight in and could be blinding if you're facing east, but he sat facing east anyway, which meant he was not avoiding the light, but choosing it. Table 4. He set his jacket beside him, folded with a care that was neither fussy nor self-conscious. He put nothing on the table. No phone, no keys, no newspaper. Just his hands, loosely folded, and his eyes moving around the room with a quiet, measuring attention that was not the attention of someone lost or deciding or unsure. It was the attention of someone who had been thinking about a place, and was now confirming what they'd thought. She brought him a menu and a coffee. She almost never brought coffee without being asked. It was a kind of assumption that annoyed certain customers, the ones who wanted tea or who were very particular about the coffee decision and felt rushed by its preemptive appearance, but she brought it to him automatically, without a conscious decision, as if some part of her had already assessed him and reached a conclusion. He looked up when she set it down. He had eyes that were not remarkable in color, a standard brown, nothing dramatic, but that held a particular quality of eyes that actually see you, that don't use your face as a screen for their own thoughts. And she registered this with the objectivity of someone taking a note. "Thank you," he said. And then, after a pause that felt genuinely considered, "Much appreciated," she said, "Of course," and went back to the sugar caddies, and she did not think about him again for the rest of the morning. Or rather, she thought about him exactly as much as she thought about any customer, which was not at all, because she was a professional and she had a morning rush to manage, and Jamie needed to be picked up at 3:30, and there was a broken latch on the back door that she needed to remember to tell Patty about before she forgot again. He came back Wednesday. He came back Thursday. He ordered eggs and toast on Wednesday and eggs and toast on Thursday, and drank 2 cups of coffee each time, and read nothing, and looked at his phone minimally, and tipped 18% to the cent. which was a kind of precision in tipping that Clara had always thought said something specific about a person, though she was never entirely sure what. By Friday, she had noted the pattern. 612, table 4, eggs and toast, 2 coffees, 18%, with a part of her brain that tracked customer patterns automatically, the way a musician tracks rhythm. On Friday, he said, when she refilled the second cup, quiet town. She said mostly. He looked out at the valley through the east-facing window and said, I mean that as a compliment. And she said, I took it as one. And she went take the order at table 2. She did not know, walking away, that she was smiling slightly. Patty, who was watching from the kitchen, passed through with the frank attentiveness of a woman who has watched human beings in proximity to one another for 25 years and has developed extremely reliable instincts about what various combinations mean, filed this observation away without comment. On the 5th morning, he told her his name. She had asked, not because she asked all regulars, she didn't, but because the regularity had reached a threshold where not knowing felt strange in asking, and he had said it with the simple steadiness of a man giving a fact. Daniel Carr. It settled in the air between them, without drama. She repeated in her head in the involuntary way you do with names you'll need to remember, and she said, Clara, because it felt like the exchange required reciprocity, and he said, I know. Patty mentioned it, and she thought, of course Patty did, because Patty mentions everything to everyone as a matter of operating principle. He said he was in the area doing property consulting work, that he was based out of the state, but had taken on a project here, that he was staying at the Route 9 motel for now. He said all of this without the over-explanation of someone constructing a cover story and without the excessive brevity of someone hiding one. Just the facts, lightly held, offered and then released. She appreciated it. She had spent 5 years in a town full of people who treated conversation as a form of excavation, who asked follow-up questions the way miners work a seam, and the man's apparent comfort with the surface of things felt, paradoxically, like more honesty than digging would have provided. What she did not know, what she was, on that 5th morning, in no position to know, was the true nature of what Daniel Carr was consulting on, and the true reason he had chosen Calder, Virginia, and the true reason he had chosen the Hollow Spoon specifically, and the true reason he had chosen table 4, which was a table with the clearest sight line to the counter and the kitchen window, and the back of the room, which was to say, the table with the clearest view of everywhere Clara. Whitfield spent her working day. She poured his second coffee and asked if he wanted anything else, and he said no, thank you, and she left him there at the window with the morning light coming in and his hands folded on the table at his eyes, when she glanced back once on the counter, not on the valley at all, but following her with the careful, patient attention of a man who has been waiting a very long time to simply be in the same room. People who met Clara for the first time almost always made the same misjudgment, and she had stopped correcting it because correcting it required explaining herself, and explaining herself required opening doors she kept carefully shut. The misjudgment was this, that the person they were meeting was the original, that the Clara who moved through the diner with her measured efficiency and her guarded half-smile and her impeccable professional composure had always been this way, had been born to this particular arrangement of qualities, and that the life she was living was a natural expression of the person she'd always been. This was wrong in a way that went beyond simple factual error. It was wrong the way all assumptions about other people's interiors are wrong, which is fundamentally because the only thing you can see from the outside is the adaptation, never the thing it adapted from. The original Clara had been different. She knew this with the clarity of someone holding 2 photographs side by side. The original Clara had been the woman who introduced herself to strangers at the grocery store and meant it, who called her friends on their birthdays with the specific and slightly embarrassing enthusiasm of someone who considered birthdays genuinely important, who had opinions about things, and offered them without the pre-screening process. She now applied to every word before it left her mouth. She had been warm in the unguarded way. The now Clara was warm too, It would be wrong. It would be unfair to her to call what she become cold. But the warmth had learned discretion. It had learned to check its exits before entering a room. The transformation had not happened in a single event. This was the thing that she found most difficult to explain on the rare occasions when explanation was unavoidable, because people wanted a single event. People were comfortable with single events: the betrayal, the diagnosis, the moment everything changed, because single events had clean edges and could be narratively contained. What had happened to Clara was not a single event. It was a series of smaller events that had accumulated over time into a weight she hadn't noticed until it was already shaping her posture. Marcus leaving had been the largest, the most obvious. She would grant anyone who needed it the narrative clarity of calling it the turning point. But the financial collapse that followed had been its own separate wound, and the isolation of early single parenthood its own, and the slow erosion of the self that comes from years of pure survival its own, quieter and longer and in some ways more permanent than any of the others. By the time she arrived in Calder, Virginia, she was carrying all of these at once, and the weight of them had compressed her in a way that pressure compresses carbon, not into weakness, but into something harder and denser and less yielding than what she'd been before. Marcus. She thought about him less now than she had in the first 2 years. What she understood was progress, and which she was grateful for, though the gratitude itself had a complicated texture. He had not been a monster. She had gone over this many times in the dark of various nights, had applied the most honest analytical attention she possessed to the question of what he had actually been, because the answer mattered, not for any practical reason. The situation was concluded, nothing would be changed, but because she was a person who needed to understand things accurately, who found the comfortable distortions of narrative less tolerable than the uncomfortable clarity of fact. Marcus had been a man who had wanted a life that turned out to be different from the one he had, and who had lacked, not the desire to do right by her, she thought, but the courage to have the conversation, to say out loud, in words that would require a response, that he was unhappy, that he was frightened, that the way of the child and the debt and the dailiness of a life he hadn't fully chosen was more than he knew how to carry. He had lacked the courage of that conversation, and so he had replaced it with a note on a kitchen table and an absence that had the terrible, premeditated neatness of something that had been planned in the same silences where the conversation should have been. She did not hate him. She had hated him, specifically and cleanly, for about 8 months, and then the energy it required had exceeded its value, and she had let it go. What she felt now, on the rare occasion she thought about him, was something closer to a complicated sadness. Not for herself, not anymore, but for the version of both of them that had existed before the note, the version that had still been possible, that had been thrown away not by malice, but by a failure of nerve that was in some ways harder to forgive than malice would have been. Jamie was 7 now, and he was the organizing principle of her daily life in the most complete and non-negotiable sense. Not as a burden, never as a burden, but as the axis around which everything else arranged itself. She dropped him at school at 8:15 and picked him up at 3:30, and the hours in between were the hours she was at the diner, and the hours after were the hours she cooked dinner and helped with homework and read bedtime chapters of whatever book they were working through. And she would not have rearranged any of it, because the structure was not a cage for container, and containers were what kept things from spilling. He was in the plain and simple vocabulary of a mother who had stopped dressing her feelings in elaborate language, because elaborate language cost energy she didn't always have, the best thing in her life. He had Marcus's eyes, deep brown, long-lashed, the kind that strangers stopped to comment on in checkout lines and on sidewalks and in the waiting rooms of pediatricians. And she had made her peace with this, mostly, the way you make peace with things that are permanently true and usefully beautiful. He had her seriousness, the watchfulness, the tendency toward careful observation, over quick reaction. He had, in some ineffable quality she couldn't locate in either of them specifically, a particular kind of gravity, not heaviness, not sadness, but the quality of a person whose attention, once given, is fully given. She noticed it in the way he listened. Most children listen selectively, waiting for the relevant data, tuning out the rest. Jamie listened to everything, quietly and without visible effort, and stored all in accuracy that occasionally startled her. The life she had built in Calder was small in its dimensions and large in what it had cost her. The apartment above the hardware store on Millbrook Street. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that faced a back alley but got afternoon light, a bathroom with a pipe that sounded expressive opinions every winter, was the first place she'd lived alone, truly alone, as an adult responsible only to herself and her son. The diner was 5 minutes' walk. Jamie's school was 7. The grocery store, the library, the small clinic where their GP practiced twice a week out of an office that smelled permanently of old coffee and latex gloves. Everything was within a radius that could be managed without a car on the days the car didn't cooperate, which had been happening more frequently since August. She had no debt. This was the thing she was most quietly proud of, the achievement she returned on the nights when the smallness of the life pressed in and she needed to remind herself what smallness had bought her. She had no debt. Every dollar she earned was hers. Every month she made the rent. She made the groceries. She put something small into the savings account she'd opened the first month in Calder as an act of principle rather than expectation. And the balance in that account was larger now than she believed it would ever be when she'd first made the deposit. She was not comfortable. She was not prosperous. But she was solvent, and solvency, after the financial wreckage of the years with Marcus, felt like a form of sovereignty she would never take for granted again. What she had not told anyone, not Patty, not the kind school counselor who had twice attempted to have the fuller conversation, not the GP who asked about stress with the rote compassion of a professional who asks everyone about stress, was the story of the debt resolution. She had told it to herself, in the version that was comfortable, which was a version where it was simply a legal error, some creditor's administrative correction, some piece of financial machinery that had, for once, operated in her favor. She knew this was not entirely convincing even as she told it, but she had needed it to be true enough to function, and she had made it true enough and function accordingly. The letter from the legal firm. She still had it, in a folder in the back of the closet behind Jamie's winter coats, because she was incapable of throwing away documentation, had offered no explanation. Third-party settlement. No further action required. Consider the matter closed. She had read it 4 times. She had called the number at the bottom, which had connected her to an answering service that confirmed the settlement and provided no additional information. She had called a second time, 3 days later, and been told the same thing. And then she had accepted it the way drowning people accept a rope, not by understanding where it came from, but by holding on. That debt had been the largest single piece of the financial collapse after Marcus, the one that had been escalating towards something genuinely destructive, toward a judgment that could have followed her for years, that could have made Calder and the Hollow Spoon and the apartment above the hardware store impossible. She knew this. She had known it at the time. And its sudden, inexplicable resolution had been the thing that made the fresh start possible, that had given her just enough clearance to get out, to move, to begin. She owed that fresh start to an anonymous intervention she had never been able to account for. She had thought about it, in the early years, with a kind of aching gratitude that had nowhere to go, because gratitude without a recipient is just grief with nicer wrapping. And then she had put it in the folder behind the winter coats and gotten on with the life it had made possible. She was good at that, at the forward motion, at the purposeful, non-looking back. It was one of her most useful qualities, and she was beginning to suspect one of her most expensive ones. By the end of the 3rd week, the rhythms of Daniel Carr's presence at Table 4 had settled into something that Clara noticed primarily through its absence on the 2 mornings he didn't come. A Thursday when a Route 9 motel apparently had a plumbing emergency that required all guests to relocate temporarily, and a rainy Saturday when she assumed he'd simply slept in, and the noticing of the absence told her more than she was entirely comfortable with. You did not notice the gap in a pattern, unless the pattern had become part of your expectation. You did not register the missing beat, unless you'd been listening for the music. She noticed the Thursday absence at 6:30, when she poured a second cup at the counter in preparation for refilling his without being asked, and looked toward table 4, which was empty, and felt the small adjustment that happens in the body when a recurring thing fails to recur. It was not distress. It was barely more than a subtle recalibration, but it was there, and she filed alongside the other things she was not quite ready to name. Their conversations had deepened by degrees so small that she hadn't been able to identify any particular moment of transition. There had been no single morning where the conversation became more than it had been before. It was more like the change of a season. There was no day on which you could definitively say summer became autumn, but at some point the light was different. The air held something it hadn't held before, and you were wearing a jacket without having decided to. He asked questions that were not the questions people usually asked her, which were questions about the practical surface of things. The diner, the town, the specials, whether the coffee was decaf or regular. His questions were lateral, coming from the side, seemingly about nothing important and somehow accumulating into something considerable. He asked once what she liked about the early morning, the specific part of it. He asked another time what she'd been reading, which had led to a conversation about a novel she'd mentioned in passing and which he'd apparently read, because he spoke about it with a particular ease of someone who had actually spent time in a book rather than just read its description. He asked about Jamie once, carefully, after she'd mentioned him in an unguarded moment, in the way of someone testing whether the door was open, and when she showed him it was. He asked with the focused warmth of someone who genuinely wanted to know, not to have ammunition for later conversation, but because he was interested in the answer. She told him, over the course of many mornings in pieces too small to feel like disclosure, more than she had told anyone in Calder since she'd arrived. Not the weight of it, not Marcus, not the debt, not the locked room, but the texture of her days, the things she loved and the things she found difficult, and the particular quality of the life she had made here. She told him about the 5:30 ritual, the 2 minutes at the window, which she had never told anyone, and he listened and said nothing, and the silence he held around what she said felt like a form of respect rather than indifference. She told him about Jamie's seriousness, the way he listened to everything, the apple turnover from the bakery 2 towns over that was currently Jamie's highest-ranked food in the universe, stated with gravity that suggested the ranking had been arrived at through rigorous comparative analysis. Daniel smiled at this, a real smile, the kind that reached the eyes, the kind that a professional assessment of him had predicted would be rare and therefore significant when it appeared, and asked follow-up questions about the apple turnover with an interest so genuine she had laughed, properly laughed, before she'd realized she was doing it. She was laughing more around him. This was a fact she came back to at the end of various days, with a dual sensation of pleasure and caution that had become her characteristic response to good things. Pleasure because it was real and she was not so closed off as to be unable to recognize and enjoy it. Caution because she had learned, with considerable specificity, what the underside of good feeling could look like when the good feeling was built on a foundation you hadn't inspected closely enough. The laughter was real, though she was certain of that much. It was the unself-conscious kind, the kind that escaped before the censor got to it, and she hadn't had much of that variety in. She tried to count backward and found the calculation more difficult than it should have been, which was itself a data point. There was a Tuesday afternoon, the end of the 4th week, when a man at the counter became difficult in the specific way that men who feel unimportant in the larger world sometimes become difficult in smaller ones, which is loudly, with conviction that volume constitutes authority. The complaint was about the soup. The soup was fine. Clara knew the soup was fine, because she had tasted it herself that morning, which was a thing she did on days when Patty tried new variations, because it saved them both the embarrassment of customer complaints that were legitimate. The soup was fine. The complaint was not about the soup. It was about the opportunity the soup provided. The opportunity to be the kind of man who sends things back, who speaks to the management, who makes his displeasure known in a setting small enough that his displeasure has visible consequence. Clara had seen this many times. She had a protocol for it, refined over 5 years. That was neither capitulation nor confrontation, but a third thing that she had never fully named, a precise, professional acknowledgement that managed the situation without endorsing behavior and without giving the man a reaction he was actually looking for, which was always some form of subjugation. She executed the protocol. She replaced the soup, which she had not needed to replace, but replaced anyway because the cost of the soup was less than the cost of the scene, and she did it with a smile that was calibrated to exactly the warmth of genuine service, and not a degree warmer. And the man left having gotten the surface of what he wanted and none of the substance. And Clara went back to counter and did not look toward table 4. But she heard him, not loudly, not performing the comment for the room, but clearly, the voice she come to identify in the way you identify voices you've been listening to, with the specificity of familiarity. "You handle that well," Daniel said from across the room. "Better than he deserved." She looked up. He was not looking at her with sympathy, which would have landed wrong, would have had the slight condescension of someone managing a fragile thing. He was looking at her with a flat, clear-eyed recognition of someone who had observed a competent person doing competent work under conditions that didn't merit it, and had simply said so. That was all. It took 3 seconds. She held his gaze for one of them, nodded once, and went to take the order at table 6. The observation stayed with her for days, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was accurate, and because accuracy, in her experience, was rarer and more valuable than almost any other form of attention. The book appeared on a Wednesday morning, on the bench beside table 4, set there without announcement. It was a paperback, a novel she had mentioned weeks ago, in the context of conversation about something else entirely. Reference in passing, as the kind of thing she used to read before the evenings got too short and the tiredness too reliable. She hadn't even been sure she'd said it clearly enough to constitute a real mention. It was a small paperback with a note tucked inside the front cover, his handwriting. She recognized it now, precise and economical. That said simply, "Thought you might want to revisit it." No signature, because none was needed. She held the book for a moment at the counter, and she felt something move in her chest that she made a note of and did not investigate further. Not yet. Patty had been watching all of this with a comprehensive attentiveness that was her defining characteristic, and with a reticence that was, from Patty, more notable than the attentiveness. It was a reticence that told Clara she was thinking carefully about something, because Patty's default was commentary, and restraint from it meant she was marshaling her arguments. The commentary arrived on a Thursday afternoon, appearing beside Clara at the coffee station like a small, deliberately timed occurrence. "The man at table 4, Patty said, without preamble, which was the only way Patty began conversations, "has been here 23 days. Clara said, "I know." Patty said, "He tips the same amount every single time, to the dollar, which is a thing I find indicative of character. Either he's a man of absolute habit, which is one kind of person, or a man who decided what was right once and doesn't feel the need to keep reconsidering it, which is another kind, and both kinds are more interesting than the kind who tips by mood." Clara set down the coffee pot. Patty said, "I'm observing." Clara said, "You're editorializing." Patty said, "I'm observing and then naturally arriving at editorial conclusions," which is different. She watched Clara for a moment with a frank, unblinking appraisal. That was her version of love. "He watches you," she said then, and her tone had changed, had dropped the performance of casual commentary and become something more direct. "Not in the way that would make me say something to him. In the other way." Clara was quiet. "He's a customer," she said. Patty shrugged. So was that man in the Carver story. Clara looked at her. Patty, that is the least reassuring literary reference available. Patty walked back to the kitchen, unhurried. I'm just saying, she called over her shoulder, and the rest of it was swallowed by the kitchen sounds. But Clara understood the rest of it. She understood it completely. The broken latch on the back entrance had been sticking for 6 weeks. Clara had added it to the list she kept for Patty, the list of small maintenance issues that accumulated in any aging building with the quiet persistence of entropy, and had mentioned it twice and forgotten to mention it a third time, because the third time had been during a rush in the latch, while inconvenient, was not urgent, and Patty's had been bad that week, and there was always something more pressing. On a Monday morning in the 5th week, Clara arrived at 5:30 and found the latch repaired. Not propped or shimmed or worked around, repaired properly with new hardware. She stood at the back door for a moment with the October morning cold coming around her and turned the latch back and forth, testing it. And then she went inside and started the coffee and thought nothing of it. When she mentioned it to Patty during the mid-morning lull, Patty set down her coffee and said, without quite meeting Clara's eye, "Landlord sent someone over." Clara said, "When?" "I was here until 8 last night." Patty said, "He has keys," in a tone that closed the subject with a slightly excessive decisiveness of someone who prepared this answer in advance and would prefer not to elaborate on it. Clara looked at her for one long moment. Patty refilled her own coffee. Clara went back to the counter. She did not ask again. She would understand later why Patty had said it the way she did. She would understand it with the specific and comprehensive clarity of someone receiving information they already suspected, provided by someone who had been waiting with patience and difficulty for the right moment. It was Jamie who first said out loud the thing that Clara had been circling without landing on, which had not surprised her. He had always been perceptive in ways that exceeded the conventional perceptiveness of 7-year-olds, had always possessed the quality of a small, serious recorder that missed nothing and stored everything with archival precision, but it surprised her anyway, because the truth often surprises you when you hear it spoken, even if you've been thinking it. Privately for weeks, he sat on a Thursday afternoon in the 5th week of Daniel's presence at table 4. He had come to the diner after school, as he occasionally did on Thursdays when his after-school art program ended early, and he had arranged himself in the far corner booth, the one across the room from table 4, which was either coincidence or, knowing Jamie, the optimal observation position. With his backpack, his homework, his grilled cheese, and his chocolate milk, which was the arrangement they had, and which Jamie honored with the seriousness of someone treating a contract. He did his homework without being told. He ate his grilled cheese without being asked to finish it. He was, in the daily evidence of his character, the best thing she had ever done, and she knew it with a certainty she reserved for only the most fundamental truths. The Thursday rush was the second most demanding period of Clara's week. The after-school and early evening overlap that brought the families and the high school crowd and the farmers coming in from the fields, and she was fully occupied for the better part of an hour, moving through the tables with the efficient grace of someone who has done this so many times that the body handles it while the mind goes somewhere slightly apart. She was aware at the edge of her attention that Daniel was at table 4, had been there since 4 o'clock, which was unusual. He normally came only for breakfast, and that he was working on something, a laptop open, papers beside it, the comfortable focused stillness of someone deep in a task. She was aware of him in a low level, constant way she'd been aware of him for weeks, which was different from the way she was aware of other customers, though she had been declining to examine that difference with any rigor. She brought him a refill without being asked. He thanked her without looking up from the screen, which was the easy, unself-conscious gratitude of someone who has grown used to being cared for in small ways by someone they trust, and she went back to the other tables and did not think about that either. She was at the register when she looked up and found Jamie watching her. Not watching her the way children watch their parents work, with the occasional curious interest of someone tracking a familiar activity, but watching with particular focused quiet that meant he was processing something, had been processing for some time, and had arrived at a conclusion. He met her eyes and looked away toward the window, which was his version of casual, and then back, which was his version of having something to say. She went to him during a gap between tables, sat across from him for the 3 minutes she could spare, and said, "How was art?" He said, "Good. We did perspective." She said, "I've seen worse subjects for a Thursday." He ate a piece of grilled cheese and looked at her and said, with the careful, leveled tone he used for observations he decided were important enough to speak, "That man looks at you like he knows you." She held his gaze. "Which man?" she asked, because she needed to hear him say it, needed the clarity of it spoken. "The one by the window." Jamie said, "The one with the laptop. The one who's always at that table." She was quiet for a moment. "He's a regular customer," she said. "We talk sometimes." Jamie considered this with the full weight of his 7-year-old philosophical apparatus, and then said, "Does he make you nervous?" She thought about this. Not the reflexive answer, not the comfortable answer, but the real one, because Jamie was one of 3 or 4 people in the world she didn't give comfortable answers to. "No," she said, and the honesty of it arrived before she fully authorized it. "He doesn't. Why?" Jamie shrugged with the elaborate casualness she recognized as his version of minimizing the significance of something he found significant. "Because you seem different when you come back from his table," he said, "like you thought about something good." She remembered that on the walk home, and she remembered it while making dinner, and she remembered it while reading the bedtime chapter, and she lay awake with it after Jamie was asleep and the apartment had gone quiet with a specific density of nighttime quiet in a small town. No traffic, just the occasional sound of something shifting in the hardware store below, the distant sound of someone's dog, and she thought about it with more honesty than she'd been applying to the subject during. Delight, like you thought about something good. She was 31 years old, and she was lying in the dark of a 2-bedroom apartment in Calder, Virginia, and she was acknowledging, to herself alone and with no audience, that the primary thing she'd been protecting herself from for 5 years was not another betrayal, not another Marcus, not the external sources of damage. The primary thing she had been protecting herself from was the particular vulnerability of wanting something. Not things. Things she could want. She wanted the apartment to be warmer. She wanted the car to be reliable. She wanted a morning off to sleep past 6. But the wanting that came from another person, the specific exposure of allowing another human being to matter to you in a way that gave them the power to alter the quality of your days by their presence or absence, that wanting she had been very carefully, very systematically starving, not as a conscious strategy. She hadn't sat down and decided, but she had arranged her life, one small choice at a time, into a shape that made the starvation possible. And she had called the arrangement strength, because strength was a story that served her better than its alternative. She was afraid, which was fine. She had always been afraid of sensible things. But she was beginning to notice, with the slow, reluctant attention of someone letting themselves have an honest thought they'd been postponing, that she was also something else. And the something else had a name, and the name was hungry, not desperate hungry. Not any kind of hungry that would make her careless. Just the ordinary human, entirely legitimate hunger of a woman who had been alone for 5 years and had recently discovered, against the expectations of the fortress she'd built, that there was a person in the world whose presence made the air in a room feel different. She noted this. She put it away. She picked it up again in the morning. Daniel was beginning to show, in the 6th week, something she hadn't seen in the first weeks. Not a different quality exactly, but the same quality under slightly different conditions, which revealed things about it that constant conditions wouldn't have. There was a morning when he arrived later than usual, at 7 rather than 6:12, and she could see in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his attention that something had been difficult. A phone call, she guessed, a conversation that had gone badly or required something considerable of him. And he sat down and was quieter than usual, not remote, not withdrawn, just internally occupied. She brought him his coffee, and she didn't ask. She simply brought the coffee and went about her work and let the silence be what it needed to be, because she was good at that, had always been good at that, the gift of giving people room. He looked up at one point and caught her at the counter, and the look he gave her was not the measured, careful attention of their usual exchanges. It was rawer than that, less managed, the look of someone who is tired of being composed and is grateful to be in a space that isn't requiring of him. She held it for 1 second, 2, and then she went to the kitchen to check on an order, and she thought, that was someone letting their guard down. She knew what that looked like. She'd been watching for it, without knowing she was watching for it. There was something underneath the surface of him that she couldn't fully see and couldn't stop trying to see. She was, under all the practicality and the careful guard, a perceptive woman. She'd been described as intuitive by people who meant as a compliment and by people who meant something slightly more double-edged. And her instinct about people had been sharpened by years of managing a dining room, reading body language, understanding the gap between what people said and what they meant. Her instinct about Daniel Carr said, there is more here than the surface shows, not less. She did not think he was performing goodness over badness, did not feel the particular chill that accompanied that kind of reading. More depth, more history, more weight, something that connected to her in a way she hadn't been able to map and was not yet ready to map, but could feel in the space between them. The way you feel the current of a river not by touching the water, but by the pressure of it against you when you're standing in it. What she could not have known, the thing that the locked room of her past kept her from assembling, the reason the connection felt resonant and untraceable at once, was that the history was real. It was not metaphorical depth or the imagined significance of attraction. It was literal. The man at Table 4 was connected to her life in a way that predated Table 4, predated Calder, predated the hollow spoon and the apartment and the 5:30 ritual at the window. He was connected to her through the worst period of her life, through the moment the ground had dissolved, through the anonymous intervention that had made the ground solid again. He knew her history not as an abstraction, not as a background detail, not as information gathered in their conversations, but because he had been, in ways she didn't know and couldn't have guessed, the author of some of its most critical chapters. He had been carrying this for weeks, sitting at Table 4 and watching her and knowing what he knew and managing the weight of it with the same kind of internal discipline she used for the 5:30 ritual, deliberately, quietly, as a necessary act of care for something that mattered. He had come to Calder because the financial provisions he'd put in place were due for their annual review, and because one of the protections he'd established was about to lapse, and because there were practical reasons that required his presence. This was true. It was also not the whole truth. The other part of the truth was the part he had been less willing to name even to himself, that he had been thinking about her for 3 years, had been receiving quarterly updates from a management company, had been following the shape of the life she was building from a distance that had felt, as the months passed, progressively more inadequate and increasingly less something he could maintain without cost. He had come, in the end, because he could not come, and the practical reasons had been, he was honest enough to know what he told himself to justify the wanting. The moment everything began to shift came on an ordinary Tuesday, wearing the unmemorable disguise of a regular morning, which is exactly how most moments that change everything arrive, not announced, not dramatic, not preceded by any atmospheric shift that would allow you to brace. It was the last week of October. Clara had had a hard few days. Jamie had been running a fever that had broken but left him with a chest congestion that disturbed his sleep, which disturbed hers, and she had come to work on 4 hours for 2 nights running, sustained by the strong coffee and the grim, particular efficiency of a parent who has learned to operate at significant distance below optimal and has made a kind of professional peace with this. She was managing fine. She was always managing fine. The managing of things, The meeting of their minimum requirements while internally running on fumes had become so habitual and so refined over the years that it was nearly invisible. She could have managed a difficult morning with her eyes closed, had basically been doing so for 2 days, and no one who didn't know her very well would have seen the strain. Patty knew. Patty had given her 2 extra breaks and had appeared once with a plate of toast she hadn't ordered, which was Patty's language for, "I see you. Here's something small. Say nothing." She was clearing the last tables of the breakfast rush. It was 9:45, and the diner was in a thin quiet between rushes. Just 2 tables left occupied. Daniel at table 4 with his second cup and his papers, an older couple at the window, table sharing a cinnamon roll, and a newspaper with the Sunday morning ease that people in long marriages bring to Tuesday mornings. When she dropped the tray, not in any slow motion, choreographed way, just it went, the full weight of it, 3 coffee cups, a plate, the small steel syrup pitchers that Patty continued to use despite their unnecessary capacity for drama. When dropped, all of it hitting the floor with a total, undifferentiated crash of things that are committed entirely to gravity. The diner went quiet. The older couple looked up. Daniel looked up. Patty appeared at the kitchen pass-through with a rapid, assessing attention of someone trained by years of diner management to distinguish between crises and theatrical non-crises that merely sound like crises. Clara stood in the middle of it for 1 second, one unguarded, unmanaged second. She felt it, the full weight of the week, the 2 nights without sleep, the relentless forward motion that never paused to ask if the person doing it was actually all right, the particular exhaustion of being the sole axis of a child's world and the diner's smooth functioning, and her own life's maintenance, all of it arriving in the same instant the tray hit the floor, like the crash had been its cue. She was one small thing from her limit, not at it. She was not a woman who reached her limit easily, had a higher threshold than most, but close enough that she could feel the proximity of it, which was itself unusual. She pressed it down. She had 3 seconds of feeling it, and then she got down on her knees and started picking up the pieces, because that was what you did. That was always what you did, and the alternative was a scene, and she didn't make scenes. She was aware of movement from the direction of table 4, the scrape of the bench, the sound of footsteps, and then Daniel was crouching beside her, saying nothing, beginning to pick up the pieces of the broken coffee cups with the practical calm of someone doing something obvious. He didn't ask. He didn't make the kind of verbal performance some people made of helping. The look what I'm doing commentary that was more about the helper than the helped. He simply picked up the pieces. Carefully, she noticed that he was taking the sharp ones and stacking them to the side, leaving her the safer work. And the older couple looked away, and the moment was managed, and it was just the 2 of them on the floor of the diner with the broken pieces between them. She looked up. He was very close, closer than the usual careful distance of their interactions, and his face was different, not the controlled, measured attention of their mornings, but something underneath that, something that had come up to composure like a current breaking the surface. She couldn't name it immediately. It looked like grief. Not for her, not pity. She would have felt that difference clearly, and it would have cost her something. Something more interior than that. Something that lived in him, and had been living there for a long time. "Hey," he said quietly. Just that single syllable. And she felt something crack in her chest. Not break, not shatter, but crack the way ice cracks in the first thaw. A sound before change. And she pressed her lips together and looked back at the floor. "I'm fine," she said, because she had said it so many times it had become its own kind of lie that she was barely aware of telling anymore. He didn't argue. He didn't say, in the infuriating way of people who had decided that your stated condition is incorrect, that she wasn't fine. He picked up the last of the broken pieces and stood and held out a hand. She took it, the physical fact of it, the warmth of the contact in the cold morning diner, and stood and let go and smoothed her apron and reassembled herself with the practiced speed of someone who has been doing this reassembly in public for years. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he said, When does your shift end? She told him 3 o'clock. He said, "Would you like to take a walk?" "Just a walk. There's a creek path behind the main street. I found it last week. You look like someone who needs air." She should have declined. The sensible version of herself, the one that had been running the operational side of her life so effectively for 5 years, declined very clearly in her head. But the other version, the one that had been awake in the dark thinking about what Jamie said about good things, said yes before the sensible version got to the end of its argument. They walked for nearly 2 hours. The creek path was not beautiful in the postcard sense. It was narrow and edged with the browning remains of summer vegetation, and the creek itself was low after a dry September, the rocks visible through thin water, but it was quiet in the deep, reliable way of paths that people use regularly and that therefore carried a residue of all those individual solitudes. And it was exactly what she had needed without knowing she'd needed it. She talked, more than she'd talked in a single conversation in. She tried to place it and couldn't, which was itself information. She told him about the 5:30 window, which she'd mentioned in pieces before, but now described fully, the fog, the 2 minutes, the coffee that was only ever poured for herself. She told him about her dream, the tentative, carefully held dream that she'd never said out loud, because saying out loud felt like tempting something, felt like inviting the universe to remind her the gap between dreaming and doing, something of her own, someplace with her name on it. She wasn't sure what shape it would take, hadn't let herself develop the shape because the shape made it real, and real things could be lost, and she'd lost enough. He listened without filling her pauses, which was a skill she hadn't seen in many people. The capacity to let someone's silence be their own rather than rushing to occupy it. He asked questions that were the right questions, that opened things rather than directing them, that showed he'd been listening to everything, and not just the parts relevant to his own commentary. He told her things in return, which she noticed were chosen with the same care he applied to everything. Not the easy biographical fact of a first conversation, not the performance of sharing, but the things that were actually true and actually difficult. He told her about growing up in Tennessee, about his father, a man he described with specificity that conveyed both genuine complexity and the long, difficult work of understanding it, demanding without cruelty, loving in a way that was deeply conditional on performance, the kind of father who made you excellent at the world and ill-equipped for the parts of it that didn't have measurable outcomes. He told her about choices he'd made. He was imprecise here, which she noted, which she filed. Choices that he said he was not proud of, that he'd spent considerable time working to make right, that had shaped the years between then and now in ways that were still being worked through. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed an honest account of something until the emotion has been worked out of it and only the facts remain. She listened. She asked no questions. She let the imprecision be, because she understood that some things were told in the time they could be told, and pushing the timeline was a kind of disrespect. Walking back, as the late afternoon light went golden and sideways through the bare trees, he stopped on the wooden footbridge that crossed the narrowest point of the creek and turned to her with the deliberateness that she had come to recognize as a signal that he was about to say something he had thought carefully about. He looked at her steadily, with no flinching, no hedging, and said, "There's something I need to tell you. I'm not ready to tell you today. I don't have the right to drop it out here without giving you the space to sit with it properly. But I need you to know that the something exists. I need you to know that I'm aware of it, and that I'm not willing to let it stay buried between us indefinitely." She felt the cold before she felt anything else, the specific alertness of a body that has learned to recognize the particular temperature of incoming truth. "What kind of something?" she asked, and she kept her voice very level because she had a great deal of practice with level voices under pressure. He held her gaze without any movement towards softening it. "The kind that changes the shape of things," he said. "I'm sorry to say it that way. It's the honest way. I'll explain it properly. Soon. I promise you I will." She walked home with the sound of the creek behind her and Jamie's voice coming from behind the apartment door, and the feeling, unmistakable and irreducible, that she was standing at the edge of something very large and very deep, and that the question of whether to step back from it or toward it was one she was going to be living inside for as long as it took him to tell her the truth. He told her on a Sunday. He had asked on Friday, briefly, careful with the asking, not manipulative careful, not the careful of someone engineering a scene, but the careful of someone who understood that this particular conversation had to be chosen, not ambushed, that she needed to arrive at it with full consent and not find herself inside it before she'd had time to prepare. She had said yes on Saturday, which had cost her something. The yes had required her to overcome, by a small but real act of will, the 5-year-old machinery that had been saying no to things that required her to be open. She was aware of this as she said it. She said it anyway. She brought 2 coffees from the diner in paper cups, which was both practical and a small act of claiming, "This is my thing to bring. This is what I offer. I am not arriving empty-handed." They met at the Creek Path entrance at 8 in the morning, which was early enough that the town was still finding itself. The streets quiet, the light still the low gold of early autumn morning, the fog not yet burned off the valley. He was already there when she arrived, which many had been early, which many had wanted to be there first, and she understood the impulse exactly, because she operated on it herself. They walked along the creek to the wide flat bank she'd been coming more often lately, and they sat on the fallen log that served as a bench, and she held her coffee in both hands and watched the water and waited, because this was just to begin. He said his name was not Daniel Carr. He said it simply, without prelude, because she would understand later. He had decided that prologue would be a form of stalling, and he had promised her honesty, and honesty required starting at the true beginning. His name was Daniel Whitmore. His father's name was Robert Whitmore, and that name, if she was familiar with regional Tennessee business history, would carry some recognition. A logistics company, now considerably grown, that had begun as a regional freight operation and had expanded over 15 years into something substantially larger and nationally present. He had grown up in that company the way some men grow up in churches or in farms, immersed in it, shaped by it, trained for it, with a particular identity that comes from being heir to something before you've had time to decide if you want to be heir to anything at all. He told her this without bitterness and without the performed modesty of someone pretending they hadn't also benefited from it. He said, "This is what I came from." He said, "This is not who I am now or not the whole of it, and I'll explain how that changed." He had married at 27. A woman his family approved of, a match that made sense on the ledger of the life he was leading at the time, and the marriage had lasted a year and a half and ended without catastrophe, but with the quiet, mutual recognition of 2 people who had been wrong about the fundamentals. He did not dwell on this. It was background, and he had made it background deliberately, because the marriage was not the part that mattered to what he was telling her. At 29, he had been involved in a business transaction, a real estate acquisition, a rural property development deal that had seemed, from his position at the table, clean and straightforward, that had displaced a number of residential tenants. He had known this in a way that people in positions of consequence often know the human details of their decisions, distantly, administratively, as line items in a briefing rather than as lives in the specific. He had signed the documents. He had not inquired further. He had moved on, because moving on was easy when the people being moved are not in the room. He paused here. He looked at his coffee. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has arrived at the part of confession that cost him something, and he said, he did not learn the full impact of that decision immediately. He learned it over time, in pieces, through the administrative trail of the company that kept detailed records, and through a lawyer who, 2 years later, at a charity function in Nashville, had mentioned a follow-up case in what the lawyer had clearly intended as small talk. The follow-up case, a creditor escalation against a young woman who had been part of the displaced residential tenants, a woman with a child, a debt, that was compounding. A woman who was, at that point, approaching the end of what she could manage. The lawyer had mentioned the name, and Daniel had stood in a room full of people informal, where holding a glass of wine, and he had felt, with a precision and totality he had not been prepared for, accountable. Not sorry in the abstract, performed way that powerful people sometimes gesture at when they've caused harm and want to demonstrate they're aware of it. Accountable in the specific, bodily, non-negotiable way of someone who understands with sudden and complete clarity that what they called a business decision was someone else's life, and that the life had sustained damage, and that the damage was on them. He had not slept that night. He had called his lawyer in the morning. He had directed the settlement of the debt, the largest piece, the piece that was about to result in a judgment, anonymously and completely. He had established a financial instrument, routed through a management company with no traceable connection to the Whitmore name, that provided structural financial support for a period of years. Not a payout, not charity, but a series of protective provisions designed to ensure that the woman in question could not be pressured by related creditors, could not be blindsided by additional claims arising from the same original action, could have the ground beneath her held stable while she rebuilt. He had directed this quietly, without announcement, without any expectation of recognition or gratitude. He said this last part without emphasis, because he was aware that it could sound like virtue signaling, and he didn't want it to be that. He had done it because harm had been done, and repair was the only appropriate response to harm. He had not told anyone. He had managed the provisions himself, through the management company, checking in quarterly for 3 years. Clara had been very still throughout all of this. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had been listening with the total, concentrated attention of someone receiving information that is rearranging the furniture of their understanding in real time, and she had been letting it rearrange, not fighting it, because she was too practiced at honesty with herself to start fighting it now. The anonymous letter, the legal firm that provided no names, the settlement that had arrived from nowhere and had no explanation, and that she had accepted because she had needed to accept it. Third party. No further action required. The folder behind the winter coats. She said very quietly, without any particular inflection, "It was you?" He held her gaze and said yes. She said his name, the real name, Whitmore, the name he'd given her not yet an hour ago, as if testing its weight, its correspondence to the person beside her. He said, "Yes." She repeated it. He said, "Yes." The creek went on. The birds went on. Somewhere behind them, the town was beginning its Sunday morning, and none of it had any relevance. Clara sat with the totality of what she was holding. The original harm, the anonymous repair, the 3 years of quiet maintenance, the weeks of careful, deliberate presence at table 4, the book on the seat, the fixed latch, the conversations about the novel in the fog and the 5:30 window, and she held all of it at once. And she did not try to resolve it, because it was not resolvable in a single moment, and she was not a person who forced resolutions. Then she cried, not the delicate, composed kind, not the cinematic kind that the world finds acceptable in the women it photographs. The real kind, the kind that comes from a long way down, from the place where 5 years of held tight things live, where the anonymous miracle has been sitting in a folder waiting for a face, and the face has now arrived, and the grief of all the years and the relief of the explanation, and the rage at the original harm, and the complicated, aching tenderness of the repair are all arriving simultaneously, and the body, which has been patient for a very long time, is no longer willing to store all of it. She cried for several minutes, with the creek in front of her and the October cold on her face, and he sat beside her and didn't speak and didn't reach for her and didn't try to make it smaller or faster or more manageable, because he understood that this was not something to be managed, but something that needed to happen, and he sat with it the way you sit with weather, respectfully, without trying to change it. When it slowed, she looked at him. Her face was not composed. She didn't try to compose it. She said, with a voice that was completely unadorned, that had nothing of professional Clara or the guarded Clara or any of the practiced versions, "I need time." He said, "I know." She said, "I don't know what I'm going to do with everything you've just told me." He said, "You don't have to know today. You don't have to know for a long time. I'm not asking for anything. I want to be very clear about that. I came here to tell you the truth, and whatever you do with it is entirely yours." She looked at him for a long moment, at the face she had been studying from behind a counter for 6 weeks, and which now contained, she understood, an entire history she was only beginning to know the shape of. Then she stood, and she adjusted her jacket, and she said, with something that was neither warmth nor coldness, but the specific temperature of a woman in the middle of something she cannot yet name, "I'll be in touch." She walked home with the creek behind her and the town waking up around her, and her mind very quiet. The way minds go quiet when they receive more than they can process and have decided, for the immediate term, to simply carry it. She let herself into the apartment. She sat at the kitchen table. She listened to Jamie's breathing through the wall. She thought about harm and repair and the years it takes to do both honestly, and she sat there for a long time in the quiet, holding all of it until the light changed and her son woke up and the world required her again. She didn't go to the diner Monday. She called Patty at 5:15. Patty picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been expecting the call, which meant she knew more than she'd said, which Clara added to the growing list of things to address when she had capacity to address it, and said she needed the day. Patty said, "Okay," with simplicity and absence of follow-up question that was, again, calibrated precisely to what Clara needed, and also confirmed to Clara that Patty's knowledge of the situation was more extensive than she'd previously accounted for. She put this aside. She took the day. She spent it with Jamie, not because she had a plan for how to spend it, but because Jamie was the most real and reliable thing she had, and she needed real and reliable. They walked to the park in the late morning, and she pushed him on the swings longer than he asked her to, and he led her without complaint, which meant he understood that she was the one who needed it. At one point, he looked back at her over his shoulder with those unnerving brown eyes and said, "Are you okay, Mom?" And she said, "I'm working through something big," because she had promised him honesty in all the ways she could give it, and this was one. He pumped his legs and thought about this and said, "Is it the table for a man?" And she said, "Yeah, buddy, it is." And he said nothing further, just went back to the swings with the easy, philosophical equanimity of a child who has decided that adults are complicated and that this is simply the way of things and that the correct response to is patience. She thought, "I raised this person. I did this." And for a moment she felt the specific, overwhelming love of a mother who is watching her child and seeing not the child's needs, but the child's grace, and it steadied her in a way that nothing else that day had managed to. She thought about Marcus during the walk home, which she almost never allowed herself to do, had developed such a refined system of redirection when the thought arose that it rarely got far. She let it, this time. She thought about him carefully, with the forensic honesty she applied to things she needed to understand rather than things she needed to survive. She thought about the note on the kitchen table. She thought about the 2 years of the marriage, the good early part and the deteriorating middle and the silent, retreating end that she hadn't recognized as an end until the note made official. She thought about what it meant that Marcus had left without accounting, had created damage and simply stepped out of the frame, had left her in the rubble of a life that had been partly his architecture, had never once turned back to assess what his leaving had done or to attempt any form of repair. She thought about this alongside what Daniel had told her, the decision he had made the morning after the charity function, the phone call, the settlement, the 3-year provision, the quarterly checks, the coming to Calder, and she was not foolish enough to make the comparison a simple moral equation. The original harm that Daniel had caused was real. It was not erased by the repair. The repair was not permission to forget the harm. She was not going to apply the kind of accounting that let people off cheaply. But she was also not going to pretend that the accounting didn't exist at all, that the 3 years of quiet work meant nothing, that there was no difference between a man who walked away from the damage he'd caused and a man who turned back toward it. She went to Patty on Tuesday evening, not to the diner but to Patty's house, which was 4 blocks from the diner and was the most Patty-like place she'd ever been in, small, warm, stuffed with evidence of a long and specific life. Every surface hosting some combination of photographs and cookbooks, and the accumulated miscellany of a woman who had never thrown away anything that had meant something. Patty opened the door and looked at her and said, "I'll put the kettle on," which was the right thing, and Clara came in and sat at the kitchen table, which was where important conversations happened in Patty's house, and she waited for the tea, and then she told her everything. All of it, beginning to end, with the financial history and the anonymous settlement and the letter in the folder behind the winter coats and Daniel's real name and the Creek Bank and the Sunday morning revelation. She told it chronologically, precisely, without the editorial asides. She sometimes used to manage the emotional content of what she was saying, because she needed to say the whole thing plain, without protective framing. Patty listened. She listened the whole way through without interruption, which was the most significant gift she could have offered, because Patty was not a woman who listened without interruption by default, and doing so required, Clara knew, a conscious restraint that was its own form of love. The kitchen was quiet when Clara finished. Patty's tea was cold. The old clock above the stove ticked. Patty looked at her with a wide, open expression of someone who has heard something that has moved them and is deciding how to respond to it with the respect it deserves. Then she said, "I need to say 2 things, and they are both completely true at the same time, which I know is inconvenient." Clara said, "Go ahead." Patty wrapped her hands around her cold teacup and said, "First, the original harm is real, and your anger at it is legitimate. And the fact that he fixed it does not cancel the fact that he caused it. You are allowed to be angry. You are allowed to need time. You are allowed to decide it's not something you can move past. And if you decide that it is the right decision and no one gets to argue with it." She paused. Clara waited. "Second," Patty said, and her voice was different now, quieter and more careful, the voice she used when she was saying something she thought about for a long time. "I have watched that man come into my diner every morning for 6 weeks, and I have watched a lot of men in 25 years of running this place, and I have gotten fairly reliable at reading them. And what I have seen is a man who has been paying consistent, quiet, unperformed attention to you from the beginning, with no audience and no credit, and nothing to gain from it except being near you. That is not nothing. That is actually quite a lot." She was quiet for a moment. "The latch," Clara said. Patty looked at her steadily. "It wasn't the landlord," she said. Clara said, "I know." Patty said, "He called me 3 days after he started coming in. He asked if there was anything in the building that needed fixing, and said he was handy with tools and wanted to be useful. He didn't say your name. He didn't have to." Clara sat with this. The kettle had long since been forgotten. "You knew," Clara said. "Not everything," Patty said. "Enough to know he wasn't a threat. Enough to watch and wait." Clara looked at the old clock above the stove. "Were you going to tell me?" she asked. Patty said, "Not until he had. It wasn't mine to tell." She stood and went to the kettle. "I'll make fresh tea," she said, "and you're staying for dinner, and we don't have to talk about any of this anymore tonight, if you don't want to." Clara stayed for dinner. They talked about other things, and the other things were good, and by the time she walked home in the early November dark, she felt not resolved, not certain, but less alone in the weight of it than she had since Sunday morning. That was something. That was quite a lot, actually. She went to the motel on Wednesday. She had thought about it all day Tuesday and through the night and through Wednesday morning, and the thinking had arrived by the late afternoon at a place that felt like clarity, not the clarity of knowing what she wanted or where this was going, but the clarity of knowing that walking away from it entirely was not the honest choice, that it would be the fearful choice wearing the costume of the sensible one, and she had made too many fearful choices disguised as sensible ones in past. 5 years, and she was done with that particular costume. She drove out on Route 9 in the early evening, in the car that needed its tire checked and would need it more as winter came, and she parked in the motel lot and sat for a moment in the car, not gathering courage. She had never been a woman who needed to gather courage, had always had it ready, had simply not always been willing to spend it, but making sure of herself, checking the foundation of what she was about to do. She knocked on the door of room 7. He opened it immediately, which meant he'd been awake and probably sitting with his own version of the weight, and he looked at her with the face of a man who had made peace with the possibility that she might not come, and who had not, she could see, been entirely at peace with that possibility. She said, "I'm not ready to forgive everything. I need you to know that. The original harm is real, and I'm still in the middle of it, and I'm not going to rush the middle." He said, "I know. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him in the doorway. She said, "But I'm also not ready to walk away from this, whatever this is. And I can't quite explain why, except that it would be a lie." He was very still. "Then we take it slowly," he said. "You set the pace. I'll be wherever is useful." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come into her diner at 6:12 on a Tuesday in September with his hands folded on the table and his face to the morning light. And she thought, "I have been afraid of exactly this for a very long time." And then she thought, "I am so tired of being afraid of good things." She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." And she drove home in the November dark with the valley invisible on either side of the road, and the stars very clear above it, and the word between them still warm in the air of the car. November arrived with a cold that comes early to the valley, the kind that sends an advance notice in the quality of the light before it arrives in the temperature, a thinning, a clarity, the air doing something to distance that makes everything look more specific, more defined, as if the world has decided to show its edges. Clara had always liked November for this. She was a person who found comfort in definition, in the visible edges of things, and November's tendency to strip the world of its softer summer approximations and show the actual lines, the bare branches, the particular gray of the sky, the way the ridge looked without leaves like a spine instead of suggestion, felt to her like a form of honesty. She walked to the diner in the mornings now with her coat buttoned and her breath visible, and she liked the cold on her face, liked the way it sharpened the transition from inside to outside, and made her arrival somewhere warm feel like an event. She and Daniel were meeting and talking in the careful, deliberate way of two people who have agreed on slowness as a principle and are now discovering what slowness actually requires. It required more than either of them had perhaps accounted for. It required suspension of momentum that both of them, in different ways, had developed toward things. The momentum of someone who had been waiting and was now here, and the momentum of someone who has allowed herself to want something for the first time in years. Slowness, against the pull of both those forces, was an active act rather than a passive one, and they both made it daily, the way you make any promise daily rather than once. They met at the creek path sometimes, in the late afternoons when she finished her shift and the light was already going, and they walked and talked with the low winter sun cutting sideways through the bare trees. And sometimes they met at the diner after it closed, just the two of them and a glass of coffee, and the sound of Patty moving around in the kitchen in the final stages of closing. And sometimes they walked to the town on a Saturday morning with Jamie between them and Daniel, pointing out architectural details of old buildings that made Jamie ask increasingly specific questions that Daniel answered with a patience and specificity that made Clara, watching from the side, feel something she didn't immediately want to name. The harder conversations happened at her kitchen table, after Jamie was asleep, in the late evenings when the day was over and the defenses that the day maintained had loosened somewhat. These were the conversations where the things she hadn't said in the lighter conversations got said, where the accounting happened in full rather than in the selected clips that constitute most human interaction. She asked him once about the business, about his father, about the company, about the specific nature of the deal that had caused the harm and whether there had been others, because she needed to know if what he described was an outlier or a pattern, needed to place it accurately in the larger picture of who he had been. He told her honestly, which she had come to expect, and which still occasionally surprised her, not in defense, not with a hedging she would have understood but not accepted, but with the plain facts of it, the things he'd been part of and the things he'd stepped back from, the rift with his father that had been developing since the settlement and had become, in the 2 years since he'd left the company, something that was civil in form and fractured in substance. His father did not understand the leaving. His father had always believed that the company was a life, that being heir to something was the same as being formed by it, and Daniel's departure had been registered as a betrayal that the elder Whitmore had not found a way to process that didn't involve a kind of cold, sustained disapproval. Daniel spoke about this without self-pity, which she appreciated. He spoke about it with the specific, patient sadness of a man who has accepted a loss that was real and made the choices that led to it anyway. She asked him about the financial provisions. Specifically, she asked him the full architecture of it, the management company, the protections in place, what was due to lapse and when and why, because she was a woman who needed to understand the mechanics of her own life when they were placed in front of her, and she had been living with a foundational piece of mechanics unexamined for 3 years. He laid it out completely. The management company was a shell specifically established for provision, with no other function. The protections had been timed to cover a 5-year period following the original settlement, the period he had judged based on research he'd done into the typical timeline of post-debt recovery, to be the most vulnerable window. The 5 years were nearly up, which was one of the practical reasons he had come when he had, because one of the provisions was expiring and required either renewal or a formal conclusion. He said he was prepared to transfer control of the entire arrangement to her, clean and unconditional. She would own it. It would be hers to do with as she chose, including closing it, with no further involvement from his side. He said, "I am not telling you this to make it feel like I gave you something. I'm telling you because it exists and it's yours, and you should know about it." She called her lawyer, Margot, a woman she'd used once for a lease dispute and liked immediately for her directness and her absence performative sympathy, the next morning and asked her to review it. Margot spent 3 days going through the documents that Daniel's lawyer sent and came back with a report that was characteristically direct. The arrangement was legitimate, was legally clean, had no encumbrances or conditions attached to its transfer, and represented. She used this phrase with what Clara recognized as a specific, deliberate understatement of a lawyer who is describing something they find remarkable, a substantial and sustained provision made entirely without the recipient's knowledge or consent, which she noted was unusual in her professional experience. Clara authorized the transfer. The paperwork was completed within a week. When the documents arrived, Clara sat with them at the kitchen table for a long time, holding the papers in her hands and feeling the weight of them. Not financial weight, though that was real and considerable, but the weight of all the invisible years they represented. The years when the ground had been held under her without her knowing. The years when a stranger had been, at quarterly intervals, checking that she was still standing. She thought about the version of herself that had received the anonymous letter in the worst year of her life and had accepted it with numb, practical gratitude and had never been able to find a face to put to it. The face was here now. It was sitting across from her at her kitchen table, drinking her coffee, teaching her son card games, telling her the truth about himself in all the ways he had. She was not done with the complexity of it. She was not sure she would ever be entirely done with complexity of it, and she did not think that was a problem to be solved. It was a thing to be held, openly, as part of the whole of it, because the whole of it was more interesting and more true than any simple version would have been. Jamie met him properly on a Saturday in mid-November, which was different from the various accidental encounters in the diner and the casual side-by-side walks through town that Jamie had been part of but not made the center of. This was deliberate. Clara had thought about it, more than she would admit to anyone except possibly Patty, and had decided that deliberate was the right approach, that manufacturing a casual encounter would be a disrespect to both her son and Daniel and the actual significance of the occasion. And so she had told Jamie at breakfast that Daniel was going to meet them at the park and that they were going to spend some time together, and she'd said it simply and without excessive framing, because excessive framing was its own form of anxiety management, and Jamie deserved better than her anxiety management. Jamie had said, okay, with the equanimity that was his default response to new information, had finished his toast, and had put on his coat without being asked, which was all the affirmation she needed. She stood apart from them while they talked. She watched from a deliberate distance, not because she was worried. She trusted Daniel with Jamie with a certainty she had not paused to examine, but that was real. But because some things needed to happen in their own space, without her as the intermediary. She watched Daniel crouch to Jamie's level, which was the kind of thing that told you everything about a person and their relationship to children, not the performance of crouching. The theatrical I am taking you seriously gesture that some adults deployed, but the natural, unconsidered dropping down, because that was where the conversation was. She watched Jamie respond, not with the wary, assessing distance he sometimes held with new adults. The careful calibration she'd seen him apply to her doctor and Jamie's teachers and the fathers of school friends, the unconscious but unmistakable reserve of a child raised without a permanent male presence who had learned to take his time, but with the alert, open attention he gave to things he found genuinely interesting. He was asking questions. She could tell from the posture, the forward lean. She watched Daniel answer them with the specific, patient detail that she recognized from their own conversations. The attention and accuracy that she'd come to understand was not pedantry but respect. Respect for the person asking. The refusal to give a lesser answer than the question deserved. At some point Jamie laughed. Fully, unguarded, head back. The laugh she only saw when something had genuinely surprised him into it. She felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't fully known was wound. On the walk home, Jamie was quiet for a block, and then he said he thinks you're really strong. Clara kept walking. Did he? She said. He said it like it was obvious. Jamie said, like it was the first thing anyone would notice about you. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. It sat in the air between them, warm and clear, all the way home and through dinner and into the evening, glowing the way true things glow when they are spoken out loud by the right person at the right time. There were complications, because there are always complications in things that are real. Daniel's father had made 3 calls in November that Daniel had told her about with the transparency that had become their operating mode, calls that made the terms of the rift clearer. Robert Whitmore wanted his son back in company, wanted the departure framed as sabbatical rather than departure, wanted the narrative of the family business intact. There was a deal being developed that required Daniel's participation or his formal renunciation of any claim, which was a business ultimatum dressed in family language, and which Daniel was handling with the quiet, practiced patience of someone who has already made his decision and is simply waiting for the other party to accept it. Clara felt the outline of that other world when he talked about it. The scale of it, the distance between it and Calder, the difference in the vocabulary of those conversations and the vocabulary of their creek walks. She told him this. She said, one evening at the kitchen table, there are moments when I think about the distance between where you come from and where I am, and the old voice starts telling me things I've heard before. He looked at her steadily. He said, what things? She said, that I'm not built for your world, that at some point the distances reassert themselves, that I will end up being the thing that gets left behind when the distance gets too comfortable to maintain. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm not going back to that world. I haven't been in it in 2 years. The question of your fit in it is not what I'm asking, because it's not the world I'm building. He paused. I'm not asking you to step into something that was built before you arrived. I'm asking if you're willing, whether we could build something together that belongs to both of us. Something that has your 5:30 window and your diner, and whatever you decide to do next, and whatever I'm becoming alongside it. Something that doesn't have a pre-existing shape. She was quiet. She said, "That's a very good answer." He said, "I've been thinking about it for a long time." And she laughed, the real laugh, the unself-conscious one, the one that said good things are available and I am not afraid of them anymore. And the sound of it filled the kitchen, and she let it. Winter came early to Calder that year, arriving in the first week of December with a night snowfall that was not heavy enough to close the roads, but was sufficient to cover the valley in the clean, non-negotiable white of first snow, the kind that makes familiar things look like they've been handed back to you with their best qualities emphasized. Clara woke at 5 and stood at the window before the alarm and watched it, the valley lying still under the white, the streetlights on Millbrook making the snow glow in particular amber blue of nighttime winter, everything quiet in a way that fresh snow makes things quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the world holding its breath around the thing it's made. She stood there longer than 2 minutes. She stood there until the sky began to differentiate from the hills, until the gray of early morning replaced the darkness, until she could see the outline of the ridge across the valley with the snow on it like an afterthought, soft and white against the pale sky. She had her coffee. She was not thinking about anything in particular. She was simply there and present, and it occurred to her, as it occasionally did now with a frequency that she had stopped flinching from, that she was happy, not in the careful, provisional, qualified way she had been allowing herself happiness for the past years. Not the happiness of managed expectation, the happiness of, this is enough, this is more than enough, don't ask for more, the real kind, the total kind, the kind that doesn't require defense. Jamie's school was delayed 2 hours on account of snow. He appeared from his bedroom at 7 in his pajamas, with his hair catastrophically sideways, and an expression of pure, undisguised joy at the existence of the delay, which was the most unambiguously 7-year-old thing he ever did, and which Clara loved ferociously every time. She made pancakes, which were a special occasion food and which the delay had promoted the morning to, and they ate at the kitchen table with the snow visible through the window and the hardware store below still closed and quiet, and she watched her son eat pancakes with the happy efficiency of someone who has decided that enjoyment requires no commentary, and she thought, this is the thing I've been holding together for, not for something that comes after. This. Daniel knocked on the door at 9:30 with a paper bag from the bakery 2 towns over, which many had been up early and had driven the 20 minutes specifically and had known or hoped she would be home. He had the easy, unself-conscious quality of someone arriving somewhere they belong, not the performance of belonging but the settled fact of it. And she stepped back to let him in, and Jamie looked up from the table and said, "Is that from the good bakery?" with an accuracy that Daniel confirmed by producing an apple turnover, which he set in front of Jamie with the simple, unaffected pleasure of someone giving something to a child they've been thinking about. Jamie accepted it with the dignity of a person receiving an expected tribute and immediately returned to his pancakes, incorporating the turnover into his meal with a strategic patience that Clara recognized as entirely his own. She met Daniel's eyes over Jamie's head, and he was smiling, the real smile, the one that reached everything, and she thought, this is also the thing, this too, the winter settled in around the town in the way of seasons that have decided to stay. The diner grew warmer and louder as the cold outside increased, the regulars becoming more regular in the way of people who have decided that a warm, familiar place is a form of community and are committed to maintaining it. Patty's white bean soup appeared on the specials board for the first time after Clara's extended campaign. Not a campaign exactly, more a sustained expression of correct opinion, and it was, as Clara had known it would be, an immediate success that Patty received with the gracious modesty of someone who had never really doubted it. The town in winter had a particular quality that Clara had come to love in the years she'd been here, the pulling inward, The shortening of distances, the way people who barely waved in summer stopped to talk in winter, as if the cold redistributed the social warmth that the busy months had diffused. She had roots here now. She knew this in the simple, unspectacular way that you know a thing that has gradually become true. She knew the names. She knew the histories. She knew which families had been here for generations, and which were newcomers like herself, and which occupied the complicated middle ground of people who had left and come back, and were still negotiating the terms of their return. She and Patty had begun talking, in the serious way that followed months of the more tentative way, about the future of the diner. Patty was 63, and her knee was a permanent condition rather than a passing complaint, and her daughter in North Carolina had 2 children under 5, and was asking Patty with increasing specificity about when she might be willing to relocate, at least partly, for stretches of time. Patty talked about this without sadness and without nostalgia, which was characteristic. Patty had never been a woman who romanticized the past at the expense of the present, but with the practical, forward-looking honesty of someone who was beginning to understand that what she had built here could be handed to someone who would carry it, and that the carrying would be its own form of continuation. The someone, it was becoming clear to both of them, was Clara, not in the sentimental sense, not because sentiment was the reason. Patty had no interest in sentimental decisions and would have said so plainly, but because Clara was a person who knew the diner in a way that owners know places, not just operationally but constitutively, knew what it needed to be and how to be that, knew the regulars and the rhythms and the exact angle of the afternoon light that made everything look deliberate. Patty had watched her for 5 years. She knew what she was looking at. The conversation became the conversation, the definite article, the one they'd been building toward. On a Sunday evening in January, after closing, with the chairs up and the lights low and the snow coming down outside the west-facing windows, Patty sat down across from Clara at the booth near the kitchen, which was where they always sat for important conversations, and said, without preamble, "I want to sell, and I want you to have the first offer." Clara sat with this, let be real for a moment. She said, "When are you thinking?" Patty said, "Springtime, April maybe. I want to be settled before summer." Clara said, "What's the number?" Patty told her. It was fair. It was more than fair. Actually, it was. Clara recognized immediately the number of a woman who has decided to value the right continuation over the maximum return, which was exactly the kind of decision that made Clara love Patty with the total, uncomplicated love she usually reserved for her son. She said, "I need 3 days." Patty said, "Take a week," and stood and went to get her coat. She called Daniel from the diner steps, standing in the January snow with her coat open because she grabbed the phone before the coat, and she told him what Patty had said. She was not calling to ask him what to do. She wanted to be clear about that to herself before she called, had been clear about it to herself, had checked it carefully. She was calling because he was the person she talked things through with, because that was what their life had become over the months, and because talking it through with him was not about needing him to decide, but about needing to hear her own thinking out loud in the company of someone she trusted. She told him the number. She told him the shape of the plan that was already forming, not just taking over the hollow spoon as it was, but reconsidering it, opening the kitchen more, adding the things she'd always thought the diner could be if someone gave it the freedom to become it. He listened. He asked 2 questions, both practical, both right, the questions of someone who had been listening to her ideas for months and understood which ones had genuine structure beneath them. By the end of the conversation, she knew what she was going to do. She had known before she called. But saying out loud to him had made it real in a way that things become real when you let another person be present for them. She made Patty an offer on a Thursday morning, sitting at the booth with the coffee between them and the dawn beginning over the valley. Patty looked at the number, looked at Clara, and said, "That's my number." Clara said, "I know." Patty said, "You didn't negotiate." Clara said, "The number was right. Patty took a long drink of coffee and looked out at the valley for a moment, and Clara saw, briefly and clearly, the thing that Patty rarely let be visible, the emotion beneath the practicality, the long love of a woman for a place she had made and was now given to someone she trusted with it. Then Patty looked back. "Okay," she said. "Let's get the lawyers involved and make it clean." She stuck out her hand. Clara took it. They shook in the manner of women who had decided something real, and Patty said, "I'm going to keep coming in for the white bean soup." And Clara said, "You'll get it free for life." And Patty said, "Obviously." And they drank their coffee while the day arrived outside. The papers were signed in April, on a Tuesday morning that was warmer than the weeks before it. With the first real green visible on the ridge and the creek she'd heard running high with snowmelt. The lawyer Margot was there, and Patty's daughter had driven up for the occasion, a tall, warm woman in her mid-30s who looked at Clara with the clear, grateful eyes of someone who's been worried about a parent for years and is now being given permission to worry less. Daniel was not at the signing. Clara had not asked him to be, and he had not offered, because they both understood that this was hers, that the moment of becoming the owner of her own place was something that belonged to her specifically and should not be witnessed through the filter of anyone else's presence, however beloved, he had said the night before, when she told him she was nervous in the way you're nervous before things you want very much. "You've been running this diner in every way that matters for 5 years. Tomorrow you're just making it official." She had held that sentence through the night and into the morning, and it had been, at various moments, exactly sufficient. She turned the sign on the front door to open at 6:15 on the morning after the papers were signed, 15 minutes later than usual, because she had stood at the window for longer than 2 minutes, and she had let herself. The valley was entirely green. The fog was low and moving the way she had watched it move for 5 years, going somewhere with what looked like purpose, beautiful in its indifference, beautiful in a way that things are beautiful when they continue, without requiring anything of you. Jamie was at the corner booth with his homework, because it was a school day, and he came in before school sometimes and did his morning reading with the grilled cheese that had been his constant here, since he was small enough to need help cutting it. Patty was in the kitchen for the last week of her transition, teaching Clara the things that didn't exist in any written form, the timing adjustments for the oven, the specific way the old range needed to be managed in cold weather, the things that only the person who had lived in a kitchen for 20 years would know to tell you. The diner smelled like butter and coffee, and the faint ghost of 20 years of mornings. Daniel was at table 4. He had been there when she arrived at 6:10, already with his hands around the first cup. The morning light coming in east-facing and clear, the valley visible through the window behind him. He had looked up when she came in and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment called for, just the steady, warm attention he had always brought a table for, the attention she had been on the receiving end of since September, the attention she understood now was not a strategy or a performance, but simply the natural orientation of a man who had found the person he wanted to look at. She had gone to the counter and started the system, the coffee, the pie case, the condiments, the specials board, and the morning had begun with the easy, inhabited quality of morning in a place that belongs to you, that you have earned and are ready for, that has been waiting, patient and warm, for you to arrive into it fully. There is a particular kind of joy that comes not from the dramatic resolution, but from the quiet confirmation, the moment not of discovery, but of arrival, when you understand that you are, finally, exactly where you were always supposed to be. It does not arrive with fanfare. It does not announce itself. It simply settles. The way the day settles into morning, the way light fills a room when the windows have been opened after a long winter. Clara had learned, over the years that had made her and the months that had remade her, the difference between the joy that was a temporary spike in the graph of survival and the joy that was structural, foundational, the kind that you could build on, because it wasn't going anywhere. This was the structural kind. She knew it with the certainty she reserved for the things she had tested thoroughly and found a hold. The harm had been done, had been named and carried and processed, not erased but transformed. from a weight into a history, from something she had survived into something she had understood and chosen, actively and with full information, to move past. The man who had caused the harm had spent 3 years repairing it and was now at table 4, and she was behind the counter of her own diner, and her son was doing his reading in the corner booth, and the valley was green outside the east-facing window, and none of it was simple, but all of it was real, and she had decided, with the full agency of a woman who had been through enough to know the difference between a thing that costs you and a thing that builds you, that real was what she wanted. She refilled his coffee at 7:15, as she always did, without being asked. He thanked her, as he always did, with the settled warmth of someone in a place they've chosen and keep choosing. She went back to the counter. She looked at the valley through the window. The fog was lifting. The ridge was fully green now, vivid in particular against the blue of the morning sky. She had 2 minutes before the 7:30 regulars arrived. She used them the way she always had, standing at the window with the first cup that was only ever poured for herself, watching the fog move across the valley with what looked like purpose. She was not alone in the diner anymore. She had not been alone for months. But the 2 minutes were still hers, still protected, still the daily ritual that asked nothing of her in return, and she stood in them and breathed and felt, with the total, inhabiting certainty of someone who has arrived at the real thing after a very long and very honest journey, exactly the quality that her son had named with 7-year-old precision all those months ago. Like she was thinking about something good. She was thinking about all of it, and it was very, very good. If Clara's story moved something in you, if it reminded you of someone who held things together quietly for longer than anyone knew, or of your own long walk back to something that felt like home, then share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Stories like this one exist because of people like you who keep coming back for them. Subscribe, if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling us which moment in Clara's journey stayed with you the longest. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next story.